Do you have sin in your life that you really are just having a lot of trouble overcoming in your life? I think that's a lot of Christians today. Welcome back to the Weekly Word. We're actually going to be talking about how to overcome sin in our life God's way. You know, if you have an issue in your life, you could go to a lot of different people. You could go to your pastor for counseling. You could go to a psychologist for counseling. You could go to a lot of different people in your life for counseling. But there's really only one of two ways that you can choose to handle sin: man's way or God's way. And I'd actually like to encourage you, I don't know what you're going through, but I do know that all of us as Christians struggle at different times and in different ways with different sins. And whatever that sin is for you, can I just first tell you, there is hope in Jesus Christ. If you've placed your faith in Him, you are already free from this sin, and you can continue to overcome this sin. And you might be wondering, Cameron, how can I do that? Well, the Apostle Paul actually tells us very clearly in the book of Colossians. And so we're going to go there together in Colossians chapter 2, and I really want to take a moment to do what Paul did, compare man's way to God's way, and see that God's way is so much better. So let's go ahead and jump on into it. Colossians chapter 2, starting in verse 20. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Paul is writing to a very particular group of Christians that were kind of starting to go back into the old ways, the old covenant, the old law. They were starting to go back into a lot of the traditions that were in the scriptures. Now, don't get me wrong, there was nothing wrong with those scriptures. Paul tells us in Romans that that law was perfect. We were the problem. We could not fulfill that law. That's why we needed Christ to do it on our behalf. But as they were going back to the old law, they were looking to the old law for ways out of their sin. And Paul wants to address that very, very clearly. You see, here's the problem, church. Oftentimes when we look for ways out of our sin, we typically default to man's way of handling sin. And that's not God's will for our life. Now you might be wondering, Cameron, what is man's way? Well, we try to overcome sin in our life by setting rules and regulations, trying to appear holier than we actually are on the inside, thinking that that's going to free us. An example of this would be when people are struggling with pornography, so they put locks on their phone. Or people who struggle with greed, so they just decide they're not going to handle the money in their household. Or maybe they struggle with laziness, so they decide, well, I'm just going to have certain times of the night when I can use my phone. Now, don't get me wrong, these rules are good for accountability, and they are helpful in following after the Lord and chasing His will, but they are not helpful in stopping the flesh. You see, when the flesh wants something, it finds a way. If you catch yourself trying to work around the rules so that way you can scratch that itch that the flesh has, well, you're doing exactly what every human does. These things don't help in stopping the flesh. They don't stop sin in our life. So how do we do that? How can we stop sin in our life? Well, the really cool thing is we just read the end of Colossians chapter 2, but Colossians was not written with chapters and verses. In fact, none of the Bible was. Most of the Bible was actually written as letters meant to be read straight through. And so Paul's advice here in handling sin, it does not end at the end of chapter 2, but it goes on into chapter 3. And what we looked at was man's way of handling sin, and now Paul is saying, I'm going to show you a better way. I'm going to show you God's way on how to overcome sin in your life, whether it be laziness, pornography, or anything in between. Let's go and look at what Paul tells us in Colossians 3, verse 1. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. In case you're not too certain what Paul is saying here, here's what he says. Fix your priorities. Put your eyes where they need to be, and that is upwards towards the Lord. In fact, there's an old hymn that says that as we set our eyes on Christ, the things of this world grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Specifically, if you want to listen to that song, it's called Turn Your Eyes to Jesus. And I find it to be a very hopeful song because that is the gospel truth. That as we look to Jesus, the one who was exalted on the cross, as we put our eyes and hearts on him, you can overcome sin in your life. And yes, it really is that simple, that the more you focus on Jesus, on pleasing him, on living for the kingdom, being kingdom-minded, eternal-minded, not living for the things that are temporal, you can overcome sin in your life. And it starts to become very easy. In fact, if you wanted to think of it like this, the closer you are to Jesus, the further you are from sin. And that's what Paul is telling us, that as we fix our eyes on Christ more and more, as we spend more time with him, not just in prayer, not just in the word, but in our thoughts, we let him reside in our hearts, constantly thinking about him, constantly striving to please him. If that is our goal and that is what we do, my friends, you will overcome sin in your life. And yes, it really is that simple. Don't do it man's way. It's not going to work. Fix your eyes on Jesus. And if you don't fix your eyes on Jesus, you will not overcome sin. You might learn to cope with it, but you will never overcome it. It will still be a part of who you are. But if your eyes are fixed on Christ, you will constantly be overcoming sin. God bless, my friends.